Yes. Hi, everyone. I'll indeed be talking in English. So just for everyone else, I do speak French and I could follow more or less the other talks, but I'm not confident enough to speak in French while presenting my own work. And so a bit about me, I'm Ursula. I'm currently based in Vienna, in Austria. Which is also where I'm from, but I did spend 3 years in Grenoble, where I was doing my PhD thesis in physics, actually. And in between, I was in Australia for 3 years at Monash University. And before I start, I wanted to thank the organizers and especially Sophie, who made it possible for me to be here and actually be in Paris this year and during the month of July. And with that, I'm going to get started on the talk. So what I'll be talking about today are tours, which are a method for the visualization of multivariate data. And the idea for the talk is that I'll start explaining a bit the concepts and what tours are. And then I'll have a bit of a tutorial just to see how you can use those in R. And then depending on the time, I'll also talk about some more recent developments that I've been working on and show some of the applications that I've worked on as well. See, worked before. So just before getting into the talk itself, there's a review paper that came out kind of recently, which currently is available just as a preprint from arXiv that we worked on. That's giving a bit of a review on state of the art in tour methods, what has happened recently, what have been some of the applications. Since I think it's not really that well known a method, I think it's a good resource to have because I don't think there has been any kind of comprehensive resource on tours previously. Yeah, I posted the link to the slides on Twitter. I can also add it to Slack later on, so you can find the links there. Okay, so we're talking about the visualization of multivariate data, and I want to kind of start at a very basic level, thinking about how do we even think about the space that contains multivariate data. And just to kind of keep things somehow not too complicated, I'll just talk about numeric variables. So there isn't really much we can do if we have categorical variables here. And so the way we think about the space that's containing a multivariate data set, if those are numeric variables, is kind of, we're spanning some multidimensional Euclidean space. And each variable that you're adding in your data set would add one direction that's orthogonal to everything else in that space. And so that's something we can imagine up to 3 dimensions, but after that, it gets kind of beyond our imagination. Rather than thinking about the axes that we're adding, we can think about it in terms of the cubes or hypercubes that are containing our data. So we can imagine going from 1 to 2 to 3 dimensions. That's kind of illustrated here in the first few pictures. So in 1 dimension, everything is just along a line. We just give one number and that's basically determining everything. In 2 dimensions, if we think about it in terms of the cube, we're adding a second line and we're drawing this rectangle. Again, in 3 dimensions, we're kind of doubling that structure and we're going to a 3-dimensional cube. And then we can not really imagine, but still imagine doing the same thing as we're going to higher dimensions. So if we're going from 3 to 4 dimensions, we're again doubling that structure of the 3-dimensional cube. And we end up with this 4D structure. And then that's still illustrated here for 5D, but I'll have an animation to make that a bit more clear maybe later when we start using the tour. Okay, so we have data that lives in this high-dimensional space. And we know maybe what to do in terms of visualization up to 3 dimensions. I would say that 3 dimensions is already kind of cheating because our computer screens are 2D and the paper we're plotting our plots onto are also 2D. If you think about 2D, then that's kind of easy. You're mapping each of your variables onto X and Y, and you could draw a scatter plot. If we go to 3D, well, we can still draw that and kind of make something interactive that we can just drag around and look at it from different angles. But if we're going to more than 3 dimensions, we need some way of mapping that higher dimensional space onto something that we can draw on 2 dimensions. And here I've just kind of a list of the typical ways of doing that. So most commonly, we would use some way of dimension reduction. And the easiest way of doing that is just picking 2 of your variables and plotting those. That's in fact a linear projection that you're making. And if you want to make that systematic, you would do a scatter plot matrix where you would plot all the combinations of variables in your data set. There's also other ways of making linear projections. Maybe the most commonly used one and most well-known one would be principal component analysis. So you would maybe make a biplot and have a way of looking at your data that's showing you most of the variation in the data set. Another way of getting such a projection would be linear discriminant analysis, for example. But quite often, linear projections don't really capture everything that we want to see in our high dimensional data set. And in that case, maybe you start using some nonlinear methods. I'm mentioning just 2 here, and I think one that's been really popular recently is t-SNE, which is just trying to get the full structure, capture essentially the distances between the points, and map that onto something that you can show in 2 dimensions. Now, kind of a different approach would be parallel coordinate plots. That's still kind of reducing the information to something that we can show on 2D. Not going to talk more about those, but I'm going to talk more about the last method I'm mentioning here, which are tourr methods. And they're quite different in the sense that they're not producing a static plot, but they're showing an animation of the high dimensional space that hopefully gives you a better idea, a better intuition about the distribution in the high dimensional space itself. And so as a kind of way of getting started, let's come back to the hypercubes. There's a lot moving in this slide, but let's first look at the one on the very left, which is just a 3-dimensional cube. Kind of in the same way as you would look at it on your screen if you were just plotting it and kind of have something interactive that you can drag around and you can change your viewing angle and look at it from different angles. Now, in principle, the same thing is something that you can do from any number of dimensions. And so here I'm drawing also a 4-dimensional and a 6-dimensional hypercube. And again, we're just looking at it in terms of 2-dimensional projections. And we have some automatic way of changing our viewing angle. So we're essentially taking that high dimensional object and rotating it around so we can look at it from different angles. I would argue that looking at it that way, because we're just slowly rotating it, we do get a lot of intuition about what that structure looks like in the 4-dimensional space or in the 6-dimensional space. So we can see how things are connected, for example, for this, for the example of the hypercube. So that's kind of a way of getting started. I'm not going to talk too much about the mathematics, but I want to give you a bit more of an understanding. So I'm going to talk a bit about notation and the kind of the ingredients to making that tourr work. So the idea is that we have our data in this kind of just a flat data matrix. It has n by p. So it has p variables, so it has p rows, and it has n columns, which are the observations. And what we want to do is we want to go from this n by p dimensional data matrix to a projection that's in d dimensions. So in what we've seen and what I commonly use, d would be 2 dimensions, and then we can draw a scatter plot. And the way of going from x to this 2-dimensional representation, which I'm calling y here, is essentially by multiplying it with a projection matrix. And that would be a matrix that has dimension p by d. And so we have a way of getting our data from this n by p dimensional space down to d dimensions, just applying the projection matrix. And so kind of what it boils down to is if we want to run a tourr, there's essentially 3 things that we need to take care of. The first one is that we need a way of picking these projections that I'm calling A here. Then we need a way of interpolating between projections, which is what's helping us understand, because we're not just showing a random sequence of projections, but it's interpolated, so it makes sense. Everything we're seeing, we can connect to what we've seen before. And then the final ingredient, which I've been working on a bit more lately, is we need a way of actually showing the projected data. So once we have Y, how are we actually drawing it on paper or on our computer screens? And yeah, that's just an illustration of what then a tour path is. So that's the combination of picking what I'm calling target planes, so the projection planes that we're selecting in some way. And then the interpolations in between. And what you can see essentially is that when you pick a new target plane, you're essentially kind of changing direction. But most of the planes, most of the views that you're seeing are what's being interpolated in between. And with that, I'm going to pass to the more R and tutorial part of the talk. So all these three components with a number of different options for each of them have been implemented in R in the tourr package. Just on a side note, that was originally written by Hadley Wickham and is currently maintained by Diane Cook and has a few contributors, which include myself. And if you want to get started with the package, you can have a look at the vignette, which we've added kind of recently. And I'm just going to go over a few of the examples from the vignette just to give you an idea of how to get started. All right, so the basic function, the main function you need to get something drawn is called animate. And that has a bunch of default sets. So if you just call animate, it will give you something sensible in most cases. And this is just a small example here. So loading the tourr package, which is available on CRAN, so you can install it quite easily. It has a data set included that's called the flea data, which I'm using for this example here. And using the first 6 columns just means that I'm selecting only the numeric variables. It has also a grouping variable that's called species, which I'm going to use later on. And once I have the data in that format, so I'm just picking the numeric parts of that data set, I can call animate. And what I'm doing here actually is I show you exactly what that will generate on the right. But I've made the command to calling animate a bit more explicit in terms of actually writing out the defaults so that you can see how those look like. So I'm calling the animate function. The first input is the data that I want to use that I've called F here. The second thing I need to set is the tourr path, which is a grand tour in D equals 2. So I'm projecting onto 2 dimensions. And I'll explain a bit more about the tourr path, I think, on the next slide. And then finally, I'm also telling the animate function which display I want to use. And display XY is just a way of saying I want to draw scatter plots. And you can see the result on the right as an animation. Just one thing I wanted to mention here, just in the same way as in a biplot, you draw the projection as these kind of axes. You also see that for each of the projected views here. So that's showing you how the variables in the data set are contributing to each of the projections that we're seeing. Okay. And so what I've done here is I've spelled out that I'm using the default type of tourr path, which is saying how am I selecting the target planes that I've called A before. And that's the grand tour, which is just saying just randomly pick projections from all possible projections that I could be looking at. That's something that works well if you want to get a first overview, if your data set isn't too large. But there's a few other methods that you might want to consider, especially if P, so the number of variables, starts to get large. A lot of what you see with the grand tour might not be very interesting. And in that case, what might be more interesting is what's called the guided tour. So if you're familiar with that, that's essentially trying to optimize a projection pursuit index along the tourr path. If you're not familiar with that, we're essentially trying to move our projection in a way such that each projection that we're seeing is more interesting than the one we've seen before, which means that we need to quantify what interesting means. Just a general idea, normally distributed usually is not interesting, so everything that's less normal is more interesting. Again, that needs a bit more more detailed qualification of what that means. I've listed also a few other possible ways of finding targets. So the little tour is essentially interpolating between a scatter plot matrix. A local tour is exploring a neighborhood. So if you have a projection that you know is interesting and you might want to see how that fits into the bigger picture, that's something to use. And then planned tour would be if you already know which target planes you're interested in and you just want to interpolate between those. And just to show you one example, so here I'm using the same data set. And what I've changed in this code on the left now that I'm changing the tour path that I'm asking for. And in this example, I've asked for a guided tour. So I want to see more interesting views of that data set. If I ask for a guided tour, I also have to specify an index function. In this case, I'm using an index function that's built into the tourr package, which is called holes. So that's one of those functions that looks for deviations from normal distributions. And in this case, it looks for views of the data where there's very low density near the center. And so that's called holes index. And what you can maybe see, so this is playing in a loop, so it's a bit difficult to see, but that's really rotating around this data set such that there's less and less points near the center. And that's actually something that can be useful to find views where the data points cluster, as in this particular example. I also wanted to talk a bit more about the second argument that we can play with, which is the displays. So those are really linked to d, so the number of dimensions that we're projecting onto. Usually we set d equal to, and we use the scatter plot display. So that was the display xy function that I've used before. You might also want to project just onto one dimension. In that case, you would use the display dist, which has two options, either showing a density plot or showing a histogram. What I've listed here as well is if you're working with a scatter plot display, you might still want to add more information. So one way of doing that is adding in color for showing different groups. Another way would be if you want to show some kind of structure, like a graph structure, you could add edges that connect your points. So that's what I've actually done for the hypercube examples. And what I'm also mentioning here is that if you're showing grouping in a scatter plot display, it might be nice to facet. So there's this option called display group XY. There's also options for larger values of d, so projecting onto more than 2 dimensions. That would allow you, for example, to show a scatter plot matrix of the projected directions, or showing a parallel coordinate plot. I have to say that I'm never actually using any of those myself. I basically work with the 2-dimensional projections and the scatter plot displays. But yeah, just to give you a bit of a tour. So if you're projecting onto 1 dimension, and you're just using the display dist with default settings, it will show you this kind of density display, where now you can see instead of the axis that we've seen in the 2D displays, we have this kind of bar chart way of showing the projection that's shown here on the bottom. That's again showing how much each of the variables in the data set is contributing to the current projection. And then what I'm showing here is how we can add the grouping information by adding color. I haven't really changed much from what I've done before in the very first tour call or animate call that I've had in the beginning, except that now in the display function, so inside display XY, I'm defining this argument call, which is setting the color. And here I'm using the species information that's contained in my data set. And what you can see is that in this data set, we have 3 groups, so 3 different species. And you can see how the tour helps you to see that these are kind of separate groups in the high dimensional space. So they might not be perfectly separated in any of the views, but just by following how they're moving under the rotation. And I think that's something that needs a bit of practice. We start to see that these are really kind of separate in the high dimensional space. And just kind of to show this off, here I'm also adding in the faceting. So what you can see here is that we have 1 facet essentially for each of the groups that are also still shown in different colors. We have a separate facet showing the x's, which are the same for all the three facets, of course. And what you can also see is that we have these shadows of the other two groups so that it's easier to compare. Yeah, and essentially what you need to do is just change the display function. So display group XY for this particular example, and then tell it how to group the data. So group by the species variable again. Okay, how much time do I have? Okay, so I'm gonna skip the new displays. If you're interested in those, I did do a talk on that in useR last week, which will be on YouTube sometime soon, I think. And I'll just quickly talk about applications. So part of my previous job at Monash was using tours for new displays in physics data. And so I did start working on a couple of different applications, as well as developing the methods and the new displays. And so my kind of the first conclusion is tours are especially useful if you want to understand shapes and grouping in high dimensions. It can show you features like nonlinear dependencies or multivariate outliers. And I've worked on a couple different examples. So the first thing I did look at was grouping in particle physics experiments. I've also looked at how we can understand the shape of posterior distributions. And so the particular examples that I looked at were from gravitational wave experiments, where there's a lot of structure in the posteriors. And we could really see nicely how we can use a tour, and in particular a guided tour, to find some of those nonlinear dependencies. I've also looked at visualizing decision surfaces from machine learning models. And kind of in line with a lot of what we heard in this session, at understanding and diagnosing clustering in high dimensional spaces. I think I'll just quickly talk about two of these examples that I have in the slides. So this is the grouping example that I've mentioned before, where I have two displays or two animations from the tour that we looked at. So the one on the left is showing you the three different groups, and that's kind of an interesting grouping problem, because they're actually all passing through the same mean. They're not really separated groups in space. But what the tour allows you to see is that they're really extending in very different directions in the high dimensional space. And if I remember right, I think that was originally something like 40-dimensional parameter space that we've reduced with principal component analysis. And I'm showing you here the tour in just the first 6 principal components. And the example on the right, I don't want to talk about it too much, but just to mention that that's something that allowed me to catch a multivariate outlier, which you can see highlighted here as a, well, it's a bit hard to see, I think, on the screen, but I've put an asterisk symbol for a point that looked kind of odd. And that's something you can only really notice in the tour, because it's really hidden in the multivariate structure of the data. And the second example, I'm gonna just skip through. So that's where we were interested in checking if a clustering solution actually led to clusters that are separate in space or not, where we used one of the new displays that I didn't have time to describe today, but that I think can be really useful if you're looking at clusters in high dimensions. And I'm just gonna summarize. So I think that the tour can be really useful for visualizing high dimensional data. If you're looking for multivariate structure, or you're looking for outliers or grouping information, it can really help you understand your data better. And it's easily accessible in R, because there's the tourr package, which essentially has everything implemented that you might need. A big advantage of using the tour is that each view that you're seeing is just a linear projection of the data. And you have these axes display that tell you how each of the variables has contributed to the current view. So it's very good in terms of interpretation. And what we found is that it can be a good way of complementing a t-SNE view that you might have obtained to have a static 2-dimensional view of your data. Might help you catch some of the kind of odd behavior that t-SNE might lead to. And a final note is that I think what would help for people to pick up tour methods and make them more useful would be to have more interactive interfaces, and there have been some developments in that direction. So some PhD students in Monash have developed packages, so the liminal or spinifex package that you might want to look at if you're interested in that. Thank you.
Any questions online?
En français ou en anglais? In English?
On peut essayer en français.
I can speak English. I was wondering, when you say that you can explore